"Get that janitor out of my boardroom. Now." The words cut through the executive conference room so cleanly that every conversation died before the echo reached the glass walls. 23 floors above downtown Chicago, the quarterly board meeting at Ashford Dynamics had barely begun when CEO Richard Whitmore pointed toward the back of the room, where Marcus Carter stood quietly beside the entrance holding a slim leather folder someone had accidentally left behind. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't flinch. Dressed in his Navy maintenance uniform with an employee badge clipped neatly to his chest, he simply paused, one hand still resting on the folder, his calm dark eyes moving from the CEO to the directors seated around the polished walnut table. Two security officers immediately stepped forward, exchanging uncomfortable glances before approaching him. One reached the doorway while the other lowered his voice. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us." Marcus gave a respectful nod, his expression unchanged, as though this wasn't the first time someone had mistaken dignity for weakness because of the uniform he wore. Around the table, several executives avoided eye contact. A few stared down at their tablets. Others shifted uneasily in expensive leather chairs, unsure whether they should intervene or pretend nothing unusual had happened. Richard Whitmore remained standing at the head of the table, one hand planted firmly on the conference table, convinced he had just protected the professionalism of the meeting. "This room is for decision makers," he said coldly, "not maintenance staff wandering wherever they please." Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that everyone instinctively leaned in to hear. "I only came to return something that belongs in this room, sir." He gently lifted the leather folder a few inches. "Someone left it downstairs." Richard barely looked at it. "Leave it with security." His tone carried the certainty of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. Marcus lowered the folder without protest. "Yes, sir." He offered a small nod to the nearest security officer and took a single step toward the exit. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet an uncomfortable silence settled over the room that felt much heavier than the multi-million-dollar decisions waiting on the day's agenda. The board members watched Marcus move with steady composure, his shoulders straight, his pace unhurried, never once showing embarrassment or resentment. One director quietly removed his reading glasses. Another closed the financial report lying open before him without reading another line. Near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the company's general counsel glanced toward the chairman before looking back at Marcus. Something was wrong, but Richard either didn't notice or chose not to. "Let's continue," the CEO announced, adjusting his tailored jacket as if the interruption had already been forgotten. "We don't have time for unnecessary distractions." Security escorted Marcus toward the large oak doors. His polished work shoes barely made a sound across the marble floor. The leather folder remained tucked carefully beneath his arm, untouched, unopened, exactly as he had found it. Just before the doors opened, one quiet voice broke the silence behind him. "Wait." The single word stopped everyone more effectively than a raised voice ever could. Marcus Carter paused with one hand resting lightly on the conference room door handle, but he did not turn around immediately. The security officers also stopped, almost instinctively, their professional training suddenly competing with something they could not quite explain. Slowly, Marcus faced the room again, the same composed expression resting on his face that had carried him through nearly 4 decades of life. At 38 years old, Marcus had learned long ago that dignity was never something another person could hand you, and it was never something they could truly take away. For the past 6 years, he had worked the early morning maintenance shift inside Ashford Dynamics. Most employees only knew him as the quiet janitor who somehow remembered every person's name, always held the elevator for strangers, and greeted receptionists, interns, executives, and delivery drivers with exactly the same sincere respect. Before sunrise each weekday, while downtown Chicago was still waking up, Marcus would unlock the maintenance office, check the building reports, refill cleaning supplies, inspect emergency exits, and quietly make certain that every conference room looked ready for another day of important decisions. By the time most executives arrived carrying coffee and expensive briefcases, the floors already reflected the morning light. The glass walls were spotless, every chair was perfectly aligned, and nobody stopped to wonder who had made that happen. Marcus preferred it that way. He believed that doing honest work well was valuable even when nobody applauded it. The younger custodians often asked him why he never complained after difficult days. Marcus always answered with the same gentle smile. Someone has to make tomorrow easier than today. That answer never changed. Neither did the way people gradually trusted him without realizing it. Receptionists left family photos on their desks overnight without worrying they would disappear. Engineers occasionally asked Marcus to keep an eye on expensive equipment while they rushed between meetings. Interns who felt overwhelmed often found themselves talking to the calm janitor for 5 quiet minutes before returning upstairs with clearer minds. He listened more than he spoke. He never repeated private conversations. He remembered birthdays, asked about sick parents, congratulated employees whose children graduated, and somehow knew exactly when someone needed encouragement instead of advice. Few people inside Ashford Dynamics knew that years earlier Marcus had earned a college degree in history before choosing a different path after family responsibilities changed the direction of his life. Even fewer knew that every evening after work he volunteered at a neighborhood learning center where high school students received free tutoring and mentorship. Marcus never mentioned those things because he did not believe kindness required an audience. His uniform did not define him any more than an expensive suit defined someone else. It simply described the work he happened to be doing that day. The leather folder still rested securely beneath his arm. He had found it less than 10 minutes earlier on a table outside the executive elevator after an assistant accidentally hurried away without noticing it. Seeing confidential papers left unattended inside a company that handled billion-dollar contracts, Marcus had done exactly what he always did when something important was misplaced. He picked it up carefully and walked directly toward the boardroom to return it before the meeting officially began. He never imagined that opening a single door would place his character on trial before the highest-ranking people in the company. Across the long conference table, several board members quietly watched Marcus with expressions that had changed from surprise to concern. They were not looking at a maintenance worker standing beside security. They were looking at a man many of them had come to know over the years in ways the newly appointed chief executive officer had not yet taken the time to discover. The silence stretched just long enough for every person in the room to understand that the meeting was no longer about quarterly projections or shareholder returns. Richard Whitmore slowly turned toward the voice that had interrupted him. The speaker was Harold Bennett, chairman of the board, a man whose calm manner carried more authority than shouting ever could. He remained seated, his fingers resting lightly on a leather notebook, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. Richard forced a polite smile. "Is there a concern, Mr. Bennett?" Harold looked past the chief executive officer and directly at Marcus. "There is," he answered evenly. "Before anyone leaves this room, I believe we should understand why Mr. Carter came here in the first place." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been appointed chief executive officer only 3 weeks earlier after an aggressive nationwide executive search. At 46 years old, he had built a reputation as a brilliant strategist capable of increasing profits, restructuring struggling companies, and making difficult decisions without hesitation. Financial magazines praised his discipline. Investors admired his confidence. Headlines described him as fearless. Richard accepted every compliment because he believed they reflected the truth. Throughout his career, he had developed a simple philosophy. Success belonged to people who projected authority before earning familiarity. He believed respect naturally flowed downward from leadership, while everyone else proved their value by following instructions without question. Efficiency mattered more than relationships. Performance mattered more than personality. He rarely learned the names of employees outside executive management because, in his mind, organizational charts existed for a reason. During his first week at Ashford Dynamics, Richard had ordered several operational changes. Reserved executive elevators became restricted to senior leadership. New identification policies were introduced. Department managers received instructions emphasizing appearance, protocol, and chain of command. None of those decisions seemed unreasonable to him. In fact, he considered them signs of strong leadership. Yet because he spent nearly every hour inside executive offices, he had never walked the maintenance corridors before sunrise. He had never watched Marcus quietly help a delivery driver carry heavy equipment without being asked. He had never seen Marcus comfort a nervous intern moments before her first presentation. He had never noticed that the building's oldest employees smiled when Marcus greeted them, because he remembered details about their families that even supervisors sometimes forgot. Richard simply saw a maintenance uniform entering a boardroom where, according to his understanding of corporate order, it did not belong. His conclusion came before his curiosity. Now, standing at the head of the conference table, he believed he was defending professional standards. "This is not personal," Richard said, looking around the room as though explaining something obvious. "Every organization functions because people remain within appropriate responsibilities. If exceptions become acceptable, discipline disappears." Several executives remained silent, but their expressions grew increasingly thoughtful. Harold Bennett folded his hands. "And returning confidential company documents falls outside appropriate responsibility?" Richard looked briefly toward the leather folder still tucked beneath Marcus's arm. "Security could have handled that," he replied. Marcus remained completely still. He neither defended himself nor challenged the chief executive officer. His restraint only deepened the growing discomfort inside the room. One of the security officers shifted his weight uneasily, clearly wishing the situation belonged to someone else. The younger officer glanced toward Marcus with quiet respect before looking away again. Richard noticed none of it. He believed the discussion was about procedure. The board, however, had begun recognizing something far more significant. They were watching how a leader treated someone who possessed no obvious power to answer back. In moments like these, character often revealed itself more clearly than credentials ever could. Harold's eyes remained fixed on Marcus for another second before returning to Richard. "Interesting," he said softly. "Because from where I am sitting, the only person in this room who has not forgotten his responsibility today is Mr. Carter." Those words settled over the conference table like a weight that no financial report could measure. And for the first time since entering the room, Richard Whitmore realized the meeting was no longer unfolding according to his expectations. Richard Whitmore drew a slow breath before answering, determined not to let the room see even a hint of uncertainty. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate the concern, but leadership requires consistency. Rules cannot change depending on who walks through the door." Harold Bennett did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Marcus again. "Would you mind bringing that folder here?" Marcus nodded once. "Of course, sir." Without hesitation, he walked toward the long conference table. The security officers quietly stepped aside. No one had instructed them to do so, but the atmosphere had shifted enough that neither man felt comfortable standing in Marcus's path any longer. Marcus approached with the same calm professionalism that had marked every movement since entering the room. He carefully placed the leather folder in front of Harold before taking one respectful step backward. "I found it on the executive elevator table, sir," Marcus explained. "The elevator doors had already closed before I could reach the assistant who dropped it. I thought it should be returned before the meeting started." Harold gently opened the folder and glanced through several documents. His eyes narrowed for a brief moment before he closed it again. "These are the only signed copies of today's acquisition proposal," he said quietly. "Replacing them would have delayed this meeting for hours." Several directors exchanged surprised looks. One executive responsible for legal compliance leaned forward. Those documents also contained handwritten approval notes that were never scanned. Harold nodded. "Exactly." Richard folded his arms. "I understand that he returned something important. That does not change the principle involved." Marcus remained silent. He neither sought recognition nor attempted to defend himself. The board noticed that before anyone else did. Harold rested both hands on the folder. "Mr. Carter, why did you choose to bring this upstairs yourself instead of calling someone?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Because I did not know how long it would take for someone to respond, sir. I believed the documents belonged with the people waiting for them." "And did anyone ask you to do that?" "No, sir." "Then why take the responsibility?" Marcus offered the faintest smile. "Because if something important belongs to someone else, returning it is simply the right thing to do." His answer contained no speech about values, no attempt to impress anyone, only a quiet statement that sounded like a habit practiced over many years. The room fell silent once more. Richard looked around the table, expecting agreement that procedures still mattered more than individual judgment. Instead, he found thoughtful faces studying Marcus rather than him. He realized that the conversation had drifted somewhere he had not intended. It was no longer about access badges or restricted meeting rooms. It had become a question of character. Richard tried once more to regain control. Intentions are admirable, he said evenly. But organizations cannot function if every employee decides which rules deserve exceptions. Before anyone else could answer, a woman seated near the center of the table slowly closed her notebook. Linda Alvarez, chair of the governance committee, had listened without interruption since the meeting began. She looked directly at Richard. "You are correct that organizations need rules," she said. "They also need people willing to do the right thing when no rule tells them exactly what to do." Richard remained silent. Linda continued, "There is another question we have not discussed." She turned toward Marcus. "When you entered this room, did you intend to participate in the meeting?" Marcus immediately shook his head. "No, ma'am. I only intended to return the folder and leave before the meeting started." "Did you speak until someone addressed you?" "No, ma'am." "Did you refuse any instruction that was given to you?" "No, ma'am." Every answer was simple, respectful, and impossible to challenge. Richard could feel the balance inside the room shifting one careful exchange at a time. The confidence he had carried into the meeting no longer felt as solid as it had only minutes earlier. Harold looked around the boardroom, meeting the eyes of one director after another. Several members responded with almost imperceptible nods, as though they had reached the same conclusion independently. Richard noticed those silent exchanges, but could not interpret them. What he did not know was that nearly everyone seated at that table possessed years of experience with Marcus that extended far beyond a single morning. And one by one, they were preparing to tell stories that the new chief executive officer had never heard. Linda Alvarez leaned back slowly, her eyes never leaving Marcus. "I believe everyone here deserves the full context," she said. Richard Whitmore remained standing, still convinced that the discussion had wandered away from the standards he had been hired to enforce. "With respect," he replied, "I do not see how personal stories change company policy." Harold Bennett folded his hands. "Sometimes they explain why the policy exists in the first place." A quiet murmur settled across the table before another board member spoke. Samuel Brooks, the oldest director on the board, adjusted his glasses and looked toward Marcus with unmistakable respect. "3 winters ago," he began, "I arrived before sunrise to prepare for an emergency investor meeting after a water pipe burst on this floor overnight. Most of the conference center was flooded. I assumed we would cancel the meeting. Instead, I found Mr. Carter coordinating with building maintenance, protecting sensitive equipment, moving documents to secure offices, and helping the facilities team restore this room before our guests arrived. He never introduced himself. He never asked for recognition. He simply solved problems." Samuel paused briefly before continuing. "That meeting secured one of the largest investments this company has ever received. Most people thanked executive leadership. Very few realized the meeting almost never happened." Richard listened without interrupting, but the certainty in his posture began to soften. Before he could respond, another director spoke. "I have one as well," said Evelyn Chun, chair of the audit committee. "Last year, I accidentally left confidential financial records in the cafeteria during an earnings review. I did not even realize they were missing until Mr. Carter personally delivered them to my office unopened. He could have ignored them. He could have handed them to anyone. Instead, he protected information that affected every shareholder in this company." She smiled gently toward Marcus. "When I thanked him, he simply said he hoped I had not missed lunch because of the stress." Several board members smiled quietly, remembering similar moments. Richard looked from one face to another. None of these people appeared emotional or exaggerated. They were simply describing events they had personally witnessed. Linda opened a small notebook resting beside her laptop. "I keep notes after every annual leadership retreat," she explained. "There is a page from 2 years ago that mentions Mr. Carter by name." Richard looked surprised. "A maintenance employee?" "Yes." Linda nodded. "During a severe snowstorm, dozens of employees were stranded inside this building long after public transportation shut down. Mr. Carter stayed nearly 6 extra hours. He helped elderly visitors reach warm waiting areas, located phone chargers for employees trying to contact their families, and even organized coffee and bottled water without anyone asking him to do so. Human Resources later discovered that he quietly paid for several rides home using his own money because younger employees could not afford the unexpected expense." Marcus lowered his eyes slightly, visibly uncomfortable hearing his private actions discussed in public. I only wanted everyone to get home safely, he said softly. Harold looked toward him with a warm expression. That is exactly the point. Richard slowly loosened his folded arms. For the first time since entering the room, he realized that every story shared by the board carried the same pattern. Marcus had never acted for praise. He had never expected rewards. The respect surrounding him had not been created by one extraordinary event. It had been earned through hundreds of ordinary choices that almost nobody noticed at the time. Richard searched for an answer that would restore his position. Those are admirable qualities, he finally said. But I still made a decision based on maintaining executive protocol, not personal prejudice. The room became completely still. Harold Bennett met Richard's eyes without anger. Intent does matter, he replied. But so do assumptions. You looked at a man in a maintenance uniform and decided he did not belong before asking a single question. Every person at this table watched it happen. No one spoke after that. Even the security officers remained motionless beside the doorway. Richard could suddenly feel the weight of every silent witness in the room. And for the first time that morning, he understood that the greatest risk facing him was no longer whether he had enforced a policy correctly. It was whether he had revealed something about his own leadership that could not easily be taken back. The conference room remained perfectly still. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown Chicago, casting long bands of light across the polished table where no one seemed interested in financial reports anymore. Marcus Carter stood quietly beside the doorway, his hands relaxed at his sides, making no attempt to defend himself or explain anything further. He had spent years learning that silence carried more strength than anger when dignity was being tested. Richard Whitmore looked down at the folder resting in front of Harold Bennett before slowly raising his eyes toward the board. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, he found himself in a room where authority alone was no longer enough to control the conversation. No one challenged him. No one argued with him. Instead, they simply waited. The silence itself had become the question. Harold gently closed the folder and folded his hands together. His voice remained calm. Leadership is rarely measured when everything goes according to plan. It is measured in the first moments when we meet someone who appears to have nothing to offer us. Richard did not respond. His confidence had begun giving way to reflection, although pride still prevented him from admitting it. Linda Alvarez slowly looked toward Marcus again. Do you know why so many people in this company recognize you by name? Marcus answered honestly. No, ma'am. Because you notice people before they notice you. She smiled warmly. You make this building feel like more than an office. Marcus lowered his eyes with quiet humility. I have always believed everyone deserves to be greeted with respect. Another board member nodded in agreement. I have watched him welcome new employees who looked terrified on their first day. I have seen him carry supplies for people recovering from surgery without anyone asking. I have watched him stay late because a single parent missed the last commuter train. None of those moments appeared in quarterly reports, but they shaped the culture of this company. The words settled gently over the room. Even the security officers no longer stood with the posture of removing someone from the meeting. Instead, they stood like witnesses to something unexpectedly important. Richard glanced toward Marcus once more. The maintenance uniform looked exactly the same as it had a few minutes earlier. The employee badge had not changed. The polished work shoes had not changed. Only Richard's understanding of the man wearing them had begun to change. He quietly realized that he had learned almost nothing about Marcus before deciding who belonged in the room. That realization lingered far longer than he expected. Harold slowly rose from his chair. The movement drew every eye in the room. One by one, without any instruction, the remaining board members also stood. Their chairs moved softly across the carpet, filling the silence with a sound that carried unexpected meaning. No applause followed. No dramatic speeches interrupted the moment. They simply stood together facing Marcus. It was not a gesture of ceremony. It was a gesture of respect. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. His expression softened, but he remained composed. You do not have to do this, he said quietly. Harold offered a gentle smile. Actually, we do. Richard remained the only person still standing behind the head of the conference table rather than beside it. Looking around the room, he suddenly understood what had happened. The board had not chosen sides in an argument. They had chosen the values they believed should define the company long after individual executives came and went. Through the windows, sunlight continued to spread across the conference room floor until it reached Marcus's polished shoes. For a brief moment, no one spoke. There was only the quiet hum of the building, the distant sound of elevators moving through their shafts, and the unmistakable feeling that something far more important than a business meeting had just taken place. Richard slowly released the breath he had been holding. The certainty that had entered the room with him that morning had quietly disappeared, replaced by a far more difficult question. If every person he respected had seen something in Marcus that he had completely overlooked, then perhaps the greatest mistake he had made was not calling security at all. Perhaps it was believing that a person's value could ever be measured by the uniform they happened to be wearing. Richard Whitmore slowly stepped away from the head of the conference table, no longer trying to reclaim the authority that had quietly slipped from his grasp. He looked directly at Marcus Carter for what felt like the first time that morning. Not at the Navy maintenance uniform, not at the employee badge clipped neatly to his shirt, not at the mop cart waiting outside the conference room. He looked at the man. Marcus met his eyes with the same calm expression he had carried since entering the room, showing neither satisfaction nor resentment. Harold Bennett finally broke the silence. "Richard, there is something else you should know." Richard nodded almost automatically. "I am listening." Harold rested one hand on the leather folder. "Every year this board recognizes employees who strengthen this company without seeking recognition. Their names are never announced publicly because they do not ask for attention. Mr. Carter has appeared on that list every single year since he joined Ashford Dynamics." Richard blinked in surprise. Harold continued, "Not because he cleans this building, because he protects its people." Linda Alvarez reached into another folder beside her laptop and removed a single sheet of paper. 3 months ago, we completed our annual employee culture survey. Thousands of responses were submitted anonymously. She looked toward Richard before reading one sentence aloud. "When I started working here, the first person who made me feel welcome was the janitor who remembered my name after meeting me only once." She turned the page. Another employee wrote, "During the hardest week after my husband passed away, the only person who quietly checked on me every morning without expecting anything in return was Marcus." Another page followed. Someone else wrote, "I stayed with this company because people like Marcus reminded me that kindness still exists in corporate America." Linda carefully placed the papers back inside the folder. Those comments came from engineers, accountants, receptionists, attorneys, executives, and interns. Different departments, different backgrounds, the same name. Richard felt the room becoming smaller around him. He had spent years studying financial statements, leadership models, acquisition strategies, and organizational charts. Yet he had overlooked the one measure of leadership that could not be calculated on a spreadsheet. Harold looked toward Marcus again. "Do you know why we never told you about those surveys?" Marcus smiled gently. "Because they were not written for me, sir. They were written for the company." Harold returned the smile. "Exactly." One of the younger directors spoke for the first time. "Culture is built one conversation at a time. We invest millions of dollars trying to create it. Marcus creates it every morning before most of us arrive." Even Richard could not deny the truth in those words anymore. He slowly turned toward Marcus. "Why did you never tell anyone about any of this?" Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "There was never anything to tell, sir." Richard frowned slightly. "Most people would want others to know." Marcus answered quietly, "Respect means more when it is freely given than when it is requested." Those simple words settled over the room with greater force than any presentation Richard had ever delivered to investors. He suddenly remembered every leadership seminar that had emphasized influence, trust, and service. None of those ideas had seemed as real as they did standing before the quiet maintenance employee he had tried to remove only minutes earlier. Harold slowly closed the final folder. "Titles give people authority," he said softly. "Character gives people influence. One can be assigned. The other has to be earned." Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Marcus. The confidence that had defined his career had not disappeared, but something more valuable had finally taken its place. Humility. He realized that he had judged a man within seconds based entirely on appearance, position, and assumption. The board had not defended Marcus because he worked in maintenance. They had defended him because over 6 years he had quietly become one of the people who represented the very best of the company. At that moment, Richard understood that the board had not stood up to embarrass their new chief executive officer. They had stood because remaining seated would have betrayed the values Marcus had been living every single day long before Richard Whitmore ever walked through the front doors of Ashford Dynamics. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The afternoon light continued to stretch across the conference room until it reached the edge of the polished table, where the leather folder still rested exactly where Marcus had placed it. Richard Whitmore took one slow step forward, then another, stopping only a few feet away from Marcus Carter. The room remained silent, giving every word that followed room to breathe. "Mr. Carter," Richard said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Marcus looked at him with the same calm expression that had never left his face. Richard continued before anyone else could speak. "I made a judgment before I asked a single question. I saw your uniform before I saw your character. I allowed my assumptions to speak before you ever had the chance to." His voice remained steady, but it no longer carried the certainty that had filled the room earlier that morning. Instead, it carried honesty. "That was my mistake, and I accept full responsibility for it." Every member of the board watched without interruption. Harold Bennett offered no approval. Linda Alvarez offered no encouragement. They simply allowed the moment to belong entirely to the two men standing in the center of the room. Richard extended his hand, not as a symbolic gesture for the cameras because there were none, and not because anyone expected him to. He extended it because respect, once withheld, could only begin to be restored through humility. Marcus looked at the offered hand for a brief moment before accepting it with a firm but gentle handshake. There was no hesitation, no attempt to embarrass the chief executive officer, no satisfaction in seeing another person humbled. Marcus simply nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Richard looked surprised by the simplicity of the response. "After the way I treated you, that is all you have to say?" Marcus released the handshake and offered a small, genuine smile. "People make mistakes. What matters is what they choose after they recognize them." The words landed softly, yet every person in the room understood their weight. Richard lowered his eyes for a moment, reflecting on them. "I appreciate your grace more than you know." Marcus shook his head gently. Respect should never depend on a title, a suit, or a uniform. If we remember that, today was not wasted. The room fell silent once again. Several directors exchanged quiet smiles, not because someone had won an argument, but because they had witnessed something much rarer than victory. They had witnessed forgiveness freely offered without demanding anything in return. Richard turned toward the board. "I came here believing my responsibility was to strengthen this company." He paused before continuing. "I now realize that the culture I hope to lead has already been strengthened for years by people I failed to notice." Harold Bennett nodded. "That realization will serve you better than any executive handbook." Richard faced Marcus again. "I cannot erase what happened this morning, but I can decide what happens after it." Marcus answered with quiet sincerity. "Every day gives us another chance to treat people better than we did the day before." Harold smiled. "That may be the most valuable leadership lesson discussed in this room all year." A few gentle laughs eased the tension that had filled the boardroom only minutes earlier. Even the security officers smiled with visible relief. Richard looked toward them. "Thank you, gentlemen. You were following instructions." Both officers nodded respectfully. One of them looked at Marcus. "I am glad we did not make it any farther than the doorway." Marcus smiled warmly. "So am I." Richard then addressed the entire room. "Before we begin today's agenda, I would like every person here to remember something I nearly forgot. Every employee who walks through these doors deserves the same respect, regardless of position. If our culture ever loses that principle, no quarterly profit will ever replace it." No one applauded. They did not need to. The quiet expressions around the table carried something much deeper than approval. They carried the shared understanding that true leadership had finally entered the room, not through authority, but through humility, accountability, and the simple courage to admit when a first impression had been painfully wrong. The board meeting finally began, but something inside the room had permanently changed long before the first financial presentation appeared on the screen. The quarterly reports were discussed, the acquisition proposal received unanimous approval, and strategic plans filled the next 2 hours. Yet every person seated around the table understood that the most important decision of the day had never been listed on the agenda. It had been made in the quiet moments when respect was chosen over assumption. When the meeting concluded, directors gathered their notebooks and laptops before slowly leaving the conference room. Nearly every board member paused beside Marcus Carter on the way out. Some thanked him for returning the folder. Others simply smiled and wished him a good afternoon. None of those gestures felt forced. They reflected habits that had been quietly built over years of knowing the man behind the maintenance uniform. Richard Whitmore remained inside the conference room after everyone else had begun walking toward the elevators. Through the glass walls, he watched Marcus pick up the small cleaning cart that had been left outside the doorway earlier that morning. Without any sign of resentment, Marcus reached for a clean microfiber cloth and calmly wiped fingerprints from the conference room door, exactly as he had intended to do before the unexpected interruption changed the course of the day. Nothing about his work had changed. Only the way people now looked at him had. Richard walked toward the doorway and stopped beside Marcus. "May I ask you one more question?" Marcus smiled politely. "Of course, sir." Richard hesitated before speaking. "After everything that happened today, why are you still doing this yourself?" Marcus looked down at the cloth in his hand before answering. "Because this is my job today, and someone should do it well." Richard nodded slowly. "I think I spent too much of my career believing leadership happened only in conference rooms." Marcus folded the cloth neatly. "Leadership happens wherever someone decides another person matters." Richard quietly absorbed the sentence. It sounded simple, yet it challenged more assumptions than any executive seminar he had ever attended. Before leaving, he extended his hand once more. This time it was not to repair a mistake. It was offered naturally, between two people who understood each other better than they had a few hours earlier. Marcus accepted it with the same quiet confidence. "Thank you, Marcus." Richard deliberately used his first name. Marcus answered with a warm smile. "You are welcome, Richard." The chief executive officer smiled in return before stepping into the hallway. Over the following weeks, small changes began appearing throughout Ashford Dynamics. Executive orientation sessions included time with employees from every department, not only senior leadership. Managers were encouraged to spend mornings learning how different teams contributed to the company's success. Recognition programs expanded to celebrate acts of everyday service instead of only financial performance. None of those changes carried Marcus's name, and he never asked that they should. He continued arriving before sunrise, greeting people with the same kindness, polishing the same floors, holding the same elevator doors, and remembering the names of new employees before anyone expected him to. One Monday morning, several weeks later, Richard entered the building just after dawn. Instead of walking directly to the executive elevator, he noticed Marcus finishing the lobby floor. Richard crossed the marble entrance, smiled, and waited until Marcus finished placing the caution sign aside. "Good morning, Marcus." Marcus looked up and returned the smile without surprise. "Good morning, Richard. I hope you have a good meeting today." Richard glanced around the bright lobby where employees from every department were beginning another workday together. "I think I already had the most important one." Marcus gave a quiet nod before returning to his work. Richard continued toward the elevators, but not before holding the lobby door open for two delivery drivers carrying heavy boxes inside. They thanked him with surprised smiles. He simply nodded and wished them a good morning. High above the city, sunlight reflected across the glass walls of the building just as it had earlier that day, but now it illuminated something far more enduring than polished floors or expensive offices. It revealed a simple truth that would remain long after meetings ended, titles changed, and names disappeared from office doors. Genuine respect never begins with a position. It begins with the decision to recognize the humanity standing in front of you.